Okay. So I quickly just wanted to review this one part here before I get into today's material here when we're talking about the spinal nerve branches here. Just to kind of discuss a little bit of information here as we're talking about our central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Our spinal nerve exits out of our spinal column here through the IVF, intervertebral foramen, and our spinal nerve gives off a branch that goes backwards towards your back. That is called the posterior ramus or the dorsal ramus. It's a small branch. It's going to innervate the deep muscles of the back and the skin on your back. Then that spinal nerve continues as the anterior ramus, also known as the ventral ramus, but I'll refer to it as the anterior ramus. And you can recall we have two small branches that come off the spinal nerve anteriorly that will connect to the sympathetic trunk. Those are called the rami communicantes. You have the white rami communicantes and the gray rami communicantes. We talked in detail about all that, but I just want to point that out because now we're going to talk a little bit about, well, I should say we're going to talk more about the anterior ramus there and discuss some of those concepts here. Starting off with a nerve plexus. All right, so a nerve plexus is going to be made up of these interweaving anterior rami that have come off of the spinal nerves. And so we're going to see them in 4 locations throughout our spine. We'll see the cervical nerve plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, and then the sacral plexus. And they're bilateral, so you're going to have the right and the left. Now, we don't really see any plexes in the thoracic region there, or even in the distal sacral and coccygeal region. Right? We do not see that. Most of those spinal nerves just go on and innervate other structures there. We will see, though, how these rami will branch repeatedly, which is good because what will happen is, right, the fact that we see this repeated branching of these individual rami, if you were to damage one specific nerve or a spinal segment off of the spinal cord, we would not be completely cut off from our sensory innervation from the skin and or muscle and the motor innervation of the muscle. So that's important to know, all right? So that's one of the advantages of having these rami branch consistently. So let's first, before we get into all the different rami or plexes, let's talk about our intercostal nerves. Intercostal nerves, obviously you look at the name and you dissect it and say, all right, this is a nerve that's going to be located between 2 ribs, right? And you are correct. So we'll see the anterior rami of the spinal nerves from segments T1 all the way down to T11 will become intercostal nerves. Now, we don't really have a specific name for them other than just intercostal nerve or the T1 intercostal nerve or the T3 intercostal nerve. But when we get down to T12, we give it a name, we call it the subcostal nerve. T1, all right, that anterior ramus is going to contribute to the brachial plexus. And then the other part of it is going to be located in our first intercostal space. That means the space in between your first and second rib. T2, right, we are going to see it innervate because when we're talking about the nerves, we're going to have sensory innervation and muscular innervation. Right, so we'll get sensory input from a specific area, and then we'll see motor output to specific skeletal muscles here. So T2, anterior ramus, is going to innervate the intercostal muscles that we are going to see in our second intercostal space. That'll be between ribs 2 and 3. We'll also get sensory input information from your armpit in the medial portion of your arm. So if you look back here at our dermatome map here, you're going to see here's T2. And it's going to be up here in the axilla and that slight medial portion here of your arm here. and then you will see it coming across the front here for that sensory innervation. All right, the thoracic nerves just pretty much will give us these strip-like layers of sensory innervation throughout, all right, this portion of the thorax and your abdominal regions there. And then when we're talking about T3, T4, T5, and T6 anterior rami, again, they're going to innervate some of the intercostal muscles there in your chest, and it will provide sensory information to the anterior and lateral part of the chest wall. Now, what about the posterior part? When we look at our dermatome map here, when we're looking on the posterior region, the dorsal ramus that comes off the spinal nerve will give sensory innervation to those areas there. Right? So the anterior rami, excuse me, will provide sensory information, or will receive sensory information from your front and the lateral portions of the chest wall. And then T7 through T12, right, we will obviously innervate some of the intercostal muscles in those locations. And then when we get down into the abdominal region, we'll innervate some of the abdominal muscles. The rectus abdominis is an example of that. And then obviously we're going to get that sensory input from those areas here that you can see on the front down through here. All right, that's for the intercostal nerves. Great picture here. You can see how here's the dorsal ramus coming off, or the posterior ramus, and that's going to supply the posterior part of your back and then the deep muscles of your back. And then our anterior ramus continues on, and it gives off branches for lateral sensory innervation, for anterior sensory innervation, and some of the intercostal muscles and some of the abdominal muscles if we're in the lower rami areas there. So our first plexus is the cervical plexus. Now, from this point on, understand when I'm referring to the plexes, all the plexes that we'll discuss, all right, gets its innervation from the anterior rami. So I'm just going to drop anterior rami and just talk about the spinal segments. All right, it's understood at this point that when I say the cervical plexus, you all should be thinking, okay, that's made up of the anterior rami of spinal segments C1, C2, C3, and C4. All right, so we will get C5 to contribute some, okay? In some cases, very few individuals, they might not contribute any. All right, so the cervical plexus is going to innervate the anterior muscles of your neck, the anterior portion of your neck for the sensory innervation of the skin, and then parts of your head and shoulders. So going back real quick to our dermatome map, you can see, all right, how we have certain sensory innervation along certain parts here of the back of your head. Has to do with certain spinal cord segments, right? But right through here, you can see certain parts of the head and the neck. Now notice the face is innervated not by any of the spinal nerves. It gets its sensory information. You need to know this from cranial nerve 5, trigeminal nerve. It has 3 divisions. The ophthalmic division does this part up here, the forehead. Right, you have the maxillary division, which is going to do the maxillary portion of your face, and the mandibular division, which will do the lower portion of your jaw there. But keep in mind, when we're talking about the face, sensory innervation comes from the trigeminal nerve. Don't be fooled on that. I really don't want you to miss that. All right, but the C1 through C4, the cervical plexus, is going to get that sensory innervation from parts of the head, all right, tops of the shoulders there, and portions of the neck. And then it'll control the anterior neck muscles. Now, this is important and worth noting that the phrenic nerve, that's the nerve that is going to innervate the diaphragm, the muscle that helps us to breathe, right? It gets its innervations from C3, C4, and C5. And how I remember that is C3, C4, C5 helps to keep the diaphragm alive. And those spinal segments contribute to the phrenic nerve here. So when you look here at our picture of our cervical plexus here, you can see here's C3, here's C4, and here's C5, and they all give contributions to the phrenic nerve right here. All right, but C1, C2, C3, and C4, all of those, all right, will contribute to our cervical plexus. And those will come from the anterior rami. Sam Raimi. All right, the next plexus is going to be the brachial plexus. This is going to be the plexus that's going to innervate your upper extremities. And so it gets its contributions from C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. Now, C8, keep in mind, remember, we only have 7 cervical vertebrae, 7 bones in your neck, but you have 8 spinal nerves in the cervical region. So there's a C8. So our brachial plexus, all right, we are going to see how the fibers are going to come off right off the side of your neck. And it's going to travel down towards your armpit, towards the axilla. Now, when we talk about the brachial plexus, we break it down into these divisions here. We start off with the anterior rami, then we're going to end up with the terminal nerves, but our anterior rami give rise to the trunks. Then our trunks will give rise to our divisions will give rise to the cords, and then the cords will contribute to the terminal nerves here. So I thought I had a picture. There we go. So this picture here kind of breaks it down and shows you what it is I'm talking about. So we get over here towards your neck. Here you can see C5, 6, C7, C8, and T1. All of those spinal segments, the anterior rami, are then going to give rise to our trunks here. And so you have a superior, a middle, and an inferior. And it's much easier to see if you had an actual model and a live dissection, because when we talk, the trunks are easy, you know, obviously superior is going to be on top, inferior is going to be on the bottom. But then when we get into our anterior and posterior divisions, it's kind of hard to see on a two-dimensional picture here. But you'll notice how the trunks give way to the divisions. You'll have an anterior division, obviously it's going to be more in front, and then our posterior divisions are going to be more in the back. And then those divisions will then give rise to our cords, our posterior, lateral, and medial cord. And then eventually we'll have our terminal branches, which are our named nerves, like the musculocutaneous nerve, ulnar nerve, radial nerve, median nerve. All right. So you see, we go through a series of different types of configurations before we get to the actual named nerves. And this occurs at various parts. Some are near our collarbone, the clavicle. Some will be down towards the axilla, the armpit there. Okay. So when I'm going through this, I just want you to kind of see that so you're not completely lost when I'm trying to discuss some things with you here. All right. So the anterior rami of those divisions of C5 through T1 are going to give way and form our trunks. And those trunks are located in the posterior triangle of your neck. You have an anterior triangle in the neck, which is closer to the front, obviously. That's why we call it the anterior triangle. All right. But the posterior triangle is going to be more towards the side, but a little bit closer to the posterior region there. So our superior trunk gets contributions from C5 and C6. The middle only has C7, and then the inferior trunk gets contributions from C8 and T1. Then those trunks divide and form our anterior and posterior divisions. And so it's here that we are going to see how these neurons are going to innervate the different parts and portions of our upper limbs, both the anterior and posterior, how some will innervate some of the extensor muscles, some will innervate the flexor muscles. So then our divisions then give way to form our cords. So we have 3 of cords, and this is going to occur near the axillary artery. And the axillary artery is actually what we call the artery that's going to flow into your upper extremity. It used to be the subclavian artery, right, which is a branch off of, well, it depends on which blood vessel we're talking, or which side of the body that we're talking about. But the subclavian artery, right, is that named artery that travels underneath your clavicle. That's why we call it the subclavian artery. Then when that artery starts to approach the axillary region, we call it the axillary artery. Once it moves out of your armpit and actually into your arm, then we call it the brachial artery, and then we see a bunch of branches come off from there. So the axillary artery, this is going to occur somewhere near your armpit here. So our cords of our brachial plexus are going to be located near the axillary region here. So the posterior cord is going to, if you notice, it's going to get contributions from all the spinal segments, C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. And that's because, right, it got branches from all of the trunks here, the middle, superior, and inferior trunks. The medial cord is only going to get contributions from the anterior portion of the inferior trunk, and that's going to include C8 and T1. Then our lateral cord is going to get contributions from the anterior divisions from both the superior middle trunks, and that's going to include C5, C6, and C7. Now, look, I don't expect you folks to know all that, but this is really what I want you to learn right here are the terminal branches that occur after we're done with the cords here. Right? We have our axillary nerve, our median nerve, the musculocutaneous nerve, the radial nerve, and the ulnar nerve. These are important because they are going to innervate certain segments of your skin, right? We call those pure patches. And then they'll also innervate specific muscles or muscle groups. So let's start off with the axillary nerve. And I'll show you in a picture here in a moment where the axillary nerve is in close proximity to the humerus, and we'll talk about something here in a moment. But the axillary nerve is going to innervate and control your deltoid muscle, right? That's that muscle that gives your shoulder its contour, helps to abduct the shoulder, contributes to extension and flexion of the shoulder too, and our teres major muscles. It gives sensory innervation to the top portion and the lateral portion of your arm, the superior lateral portion of your arm, which is around your shoulder. All right, the next nerve is the median nerve. This nerve here is going to control not all, but most of your flexor muscles in your forearm. Those muscles are located in the anterior compartment there. It's also going to help with the thenar muscles. Those are the muscles at the base of your thumb, that big fat, not fatty, but that pad area there at the base of your thumb, that's the thenar eminence. So the muscles in there are mainly going to help to move your thumb around. Then we have the lateral lumbricals. Those muscles are lateral on either side of your fingers there. And then it provides that sensory innervation from the palm of your hand, okay, when you're in the anatomical position, the anterior surface, the palm side of your hand, and your fingertips, but on the dorsal portion, which is going to be the back side of your fingers, pretty much your thumb, your index finger, your middle finger, and then half of your ring finger, but not your pinky. Okay, so it'll have sensory innervation for those areas. Just kind of a side note, the median nerve is the nerve that gets entrapped when you have carpal tunnel syndrome, because the median nerve travels through the carpal tunnel there. And so you'll start to see weakness in these muscles here, the thenar muscles, all right? Not just those particularly, but also the lumbricals. So all you have to do is ask somebody to pinch a piece of paper between their thumb and their index finger. And if you're able to pull that paper away, you're not going to pull it hard. You're just going to kind of pull it, not with a lot of force. Those with compromised carpal tunnel, if it's pretty significant, that median nerve will not be able to innervate the muscles there. Okay. Then we have our musculocutaneous nerve. This nerve is going to innervate the flexor muscles of your elbow. So it's going to innervate the anterior arm muscles, brachialis, biceps brachii, all right, coracle brachialis. So also it receives its sensory innervation or its sensory input from the lateral portion of your forearm. So when you are in, okay, the anatomical position, that will be the thumb side of your forearm. Then we have our radial nerve. This is going to innervate the posterior muscles of your arm, which are going to be your elbow extensors. That's the triceps brachii. And it's also going to innervate the posterior forearm muscles. Those are the extensor muscle group on the back of your forearm. It also provides sensory input from the back portion of your arm and the back portion of your forearm and on the back of your hand, but on the side, the dorsal lateral portion of your hand. Finally, the ulnar nerve is going to innervate, right, the anterior forearm muscles, some of those muscles that weren't innervated by the median nerve. Okay, those will be the flexor muscles. And we'll see pretty much most of the intrinsic hand muscles, all those little muscles that we learned about that are found in your hand there in the fingers. Okay, sensory input is going to be on the palmar side and the dorsal portion of those last two fingers that I mentioned. Remember, we were talking about the median nerve, how the median nerve gets sensory input for the first, second, third, and half of your fourth digit, but not the pinky. Well, the ulnar nerve picks up what the median nerve does not. So it is going to get sensory input also from the palmar side and the dorsal aspect, all right, of those fingertips for your pinky and the other half of your fourth digit, which is the ring finger. We already took a peek at that. So let's take a look at where these nerves are, where they reside. All right. So when we get down here into the axilla, we'll start to see some of those terminal nerve branches give rise. The axillary nerve is right here. Your deltoid muscle is right around this location. But notice the axillary nerve is in close proximity to the surgical neck of the humerus. And if you recall, we said that the surgical neck is the part of the humerus that's most frequently fractured. And so the axillary nerve is in close proximity. So a lot of times when you have a surgical neck break, there's a likelihood of damaging the axillary nerve. Our musculocutaneous nerve travels down the anterior portion of your arm. So it's going to innervate the flexors of the arm or the elbow. And then we'll see here, right, we have the ulnar nerve. It's going to be on the ulnar side of your arm. That's the medial portion. Here's the ulnar bone. So the ulnar nerve travels down. You'll notice it goes right behind the medial epicondyle, your funny bone. So this nerve gets banged right behind that medial epicondyle. That's the ulnar nerve. You'll see here in the lateral portion, you'll see the radial nerve traveling down. All right, so that's going to be on the lateral side of your arm, and that's the same side that the radius is on. And then directly down here in the middle of your forearm, that's the median nerve. You can see the median nerve heading right here for the carpal tunnel. And so it gets trapped here in the carpal tunnel. Now, what we'll see sometimes is the recurrent branch of the median nerve may come off the median nerve before the carpal tunnel. It innervates the thenar muscle. So in some cases, people will complain of ulnar or carpal tunnel. They might not get that weakened muscle of the thenars, all right, that paper test I was telling you about. So it's not a 100% way to test it, but sometimes folks do. All right, our third plexus is the lumbar plexus. The lumbar plexus comes from segments L1, L2, L3, and L4. And so with the lumbar plexus, we're only going to deal with divisions. We don't have to deal with cords and all that other fun stuff or trunks. All right, we just have posterior and anterior division off of the lumbar plexus. So the terminal nerves are the femoral nerve and the obturator nerve. The femoral nerve is going to come off the posterior division of the lumbar plexus. It's going to innervate the anterior thigh muscles. Those are your quadriceps muscles. All right, so that's going to help with hip flexion, but mainly knee extension. It's going to straighten the leg out. And also sartorius, that long strapping muscle that crosses over the front of your thigh there. It's going to receive sensory input from the anterior portion of your thigh, and then also the inferior medial portion of your thigh, which is going to be on the inside of your leg close to the knee. and then also the medial portion of your leg. So that'll be on the inside of your calf, the medial portion of the leg there, okay? The other terminal nerve is going to be the obturator nerve. That comes off the anterior division here. That's going to innervate the adductor group, which is the medial thigh muscles. And then its sensory input is going to be where the femoral nerve wasn't covering, the superior medial portion of your thigh. So up near the groin on the inside of your thigh there. All right, so here you can see the lumbar plexes. Okay, L1, L2, L3, L4. And you'll see how we will give rise to our femoral nerve here, and then also our obturator nerve. And now if we zoom in, you'll notice the femoral nerve here branches out and covers most of the anterior portion here of your thigh. So it's going to innervate all these muscles here on the anterior portion. And then our obturator nerve, you see it comes down on the inside of your thigh. It's going to innervate the adductor group, the medial thigh muscles here. All right, now our final plexes, that's going to be the sacral plexes. The sacral plexes are going to get contributions from L4, L5, S1, 2, 3, and 4. So similar type of scenario, we're going to just deal with divisions here. All right, so our anterior divisions are going to innervate the flexor muscle group in our lower extremity. And then our posterior division is going to be extensor muscles. Easy to remember. So I can't talk about nerves and not talk about the largest and longest nerve in the body, the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve is going to have both anterior and posterior contributions to the sciatic nerve. Now, the sciatic nerve is going to travel down through the posterior region of your thigh. And just before it gets to the knee, it's going to divide into two branches, the tibial and the common fibular. And this happens just above the knee, all right, or just as it's about to get to what we call the popliteal fossa. It's known as the popliteal fossa or the popliteal fossa, however you want to pronounce that, okay? So this happens just before we get to the knee here. All right, so our tibial nerve is going to be made up of the anterior division, and our common fibular nerve, also known as the common peroneal nerve. So if you hear me use the common peroneal nerve, I apologize. All right, I'm going to try to stick with common fibular nerve. All right, but the common fibular nerve is made up of the posterior division. So the tibial nerve is going to innervate our hamstring muscles. You know, those muscles on the back of your thigh that help with hip extension and knee flexion, bending of the knee, but also it's going to innervate the hamstring part of the adductor magnus muscle, which is pretty close to the hamstring muscle group there. So the tibial nerve, when it gets down towards the foot, is going to split off into the lateral and medial plantar nerves. And those are going to innervate the plantar muscles of the foot. That's going to be on the bottom of the foot, right? So that's going to innervate some of the flexors there. And it's going to receive sensory input from the bottom of your foot. The common fibular nerve, though, is going to innervate the short head of the biceps femoris. Remember, the biceps femoris is the most lateral muscle group, the most lateral muscle in the hamstrings muscle group in your thigh. And again, it helps with hip extension and knee flexion there. And so the common fibular nerve is going to divide and give us the deep fibular nerve and the superficial nerve, the superficial fibular nerve. The deep is going to innervate the muscles on your shin, your anterior leg muscles. That's going to contribute to dorsiflexion there, all right? And so it'll also innervate the muscles on the top of your foot. Again, those will help to extend the toes, and the anterior leg muscles will help to dorsiflex your ankle there. and it's going to get its sensory input from a small portion, all right, of skin between your first and second toe. So here's your big toe, and then right next to it is your second toe. All right, and then there's a small patch of skin, pretty much just right here. If you wear flip-flops, that where the little, I don't know what you would call that, the thing that you slide in between your first and second toe, okay? So when that, whatever that thing is that holds the flip-flop together is pressing against that skin there, right? It's your deep fibular nerve that is transmitting that sensory input up to your brain, because that's the small skin patch that it innervates. The superficial fibular nerve is going to innervate the muscles in the lateral compartment of your leg. You should remember those. Remember the fibularis longus and the fibularis brevis, also known as the peroneus longus and peroneus brevis. Right? Those are the muscles on the lateral compartment of your leg. Mainly perform eversion of your foot there. But they're going to contribute sensory input from the top of your foot and the front anterior inferior portion of your leg, down by the ankle. So here you can see your sacral plexus here. You'll notice we have our anterior and posterior divisions, but both of those contribute to our sciatic nerve. All right, so let's take a peek and see. We look at our lower extremity here. You can see the sciatic nerve coming down, all right, through the thigh. And just before we get to the knee here, all right, it gives us two branches. It gives us the common fibular nerve, which is, of course, going to head over towards the fibula. And then our tibial nerve, which is going to be more medial here. Now, notice that common fibular nerve, as it's descending, it's traveling in close proximity here to the head of the fibula. So sometimes if you receive a blow lateral here, happens quite a bit in football, you can damage this nerve. You could quite possibly break the neck of the fibula and again, damage the common fibular nerve. You get a foot drop, all these other issues going on here. And then as we get down further, we'll see the tibial nerve divides again into our medial and lateral plantar nerves, which are going to go and innervate the bottom of your feet here for sensory information, all right, the sole of your foot. And that's it, folks. Like Porky Pig said, biddy, that's all, folks. All right, quickly, let's pull up the remaining slides for chapter 14 and run through those here real quick. Okay, so last time when we went over the spinal cord, we did the longitudinal presentation. Now we're going to do the transverse slides here. So if we were to cut you in half like a magician sawing his assistant, all right, in those boxes there. So that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to show you all the layers of structures that surround your spinal cord. We're going to start with the most superficial and then work our way inwards towards the deeper structures. So of course, the outermost area that or structure that surrounds the spinal cord is your spine. All right, the bones, the vertebra. Well, the covering to the vertebra is referred to, as you know, the periosteum. So that's what that arrow is pointing to, all right, with that blue coloration there. That's the periosteum. Deep to the periosteum, we have a space there, the epidural space, right? Except there's actually something that resides in this space, and that's our epidural fat, loaded, right, with that adipose tissue and lots of blood vessels. So, as you know, adipose tissue fat acts as an insulator, but here it's going to also act as cushioning. Right, remember, our spinal cord is precious cargo. We have to protect it, and this is one of the many ways that we do protect it. We throw some fat around it to keep it so from bouncing around in the spinal canal there. Right, so you'll notice in this space here, all right, for those of you that are familiar or ever had an epidural injection, well, guess what? We're going to take a needle and we're going to stick it into that space there to administer our anesthesia. Fat is highly highly vascularized. Look at that picture. Look at all those blood vessels there. So it's a great place to administer our anesthesia. So all we have to do is pass our needle in between two vertebrae. We're going to have to go through one of the ligaments that connect the vertebrae to one another. But once we get past that, it's almost smooth sailing. We get the needle into this area here and we release our anesthesia. It's quickly absorbed by all the fat tissue and all the blood vessels there. All right, let's go deep to the epidural space and we'll come across our dura mater. This is the outermost layer of your spinal meninges. This is the thickest, toughest layer of the spinal meninges, dura meaning tough. This is the tough mother. All right, just deep to that is our middle layer, the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater sits in between the dura mater and the pia mater. Right, you'll notice then deep to the arachnoid mater, there's another space. This space is not an empty space. This space is going to contain, right, our cerebral spinal fluid. So if you've ever had the experience of having a spinal tap done, what we have to do is now we have to bring a needle through all these layers and bring that needle into this space here to collect some cerebral spinal fluid. We might suspect that you have meningitis. Hopefully, it's not bacterial meningitis. That's a pretty bad type of meningitis. But what we're going to do is we're going to collect some of the cerebral spinal fluid that's located here in our subarachnoid space here. Yes, yes, yes. Lumbar puncture. Correct, correct. So then finally, just deep to that is going to be the pia mater. Now the pia mater is the thinnest layer of the spinal meninges here, and it covers, it adheres to all the surfaces and all the nooks and crannies here of the spinal cord. It directly covers the spinal cord itself. Do not, yeah, no, I hear that. Yeah, I don't recommend it to anybody. Anytime I have not, well, I shouldn't say I have not because I'm sure I have, but the last several people that I've talked to that have had to have a spinal tap, they've had terrible headaches afterwards. And usually when you draw out some of the cerebral spinal fluid, we need to maintain a certain volume in those areas there, right? And if you start to decrease or even increase, right, you can have headache pain, and that's usually a symptom of well, if you get hydrocephalus, that's when you have too much cerebral spinal fluid and it's not getting, it's not moving out of the subarachnoid space up in the cranium of the head there. But at the same time, I had a friend of mine, they did it on her, and she said they didn't take much, or that's what at least they told her, but she had some of the worst headaches she'd ever experienced with that. So I totally get it. So here you can see that pia mater just surrounding that spinal cord there. All right, so if you recall, when we were covering chapter 14 in lecture, we talked about white matter and gray matter. We talked about the posterior, lateral, and anterior funiculus. Now I'm going to show you all those areas, but we're going to put a little bit of a spin on those terms there, okay? So if you notice, the white matter is on the outside, the gray matter is on the inside. So, and I'm going to use two different models for this, all right? This model and the previous model. All right, so that's all white matter there. So here, all right, on the posterior portion of our spinal cord, we refer to that as the posterior white column. Now, any spinal tracts in that area are going to be sensory spinal tracts. They're going to be ascending tracts. All right, so that's the posterior white column. You can see it on this model, and you can see it on this model. Right, now keep in mind, white matter is myelinated axons. Gray matter is a different story here, but white matter, myelinated axons. All right, we move out to the side here of our spinal cord. Then we have our lateral white column. Lateral white column is going to contain a mixture of ascending and descending tracts, both sensory and motor. You can see the lateral white column here. And then we have the anterior white column in the front there. Again, that will have a mixture of sensory and motor tracts. in the anterior portion of our spinal cord. There, there. All right, now let's flip it and talk about the gray matter. So our gray matter is going to be made up of unmyelinated axons, cell bodies. All right, that's going to include like the dendrites, because the dendrites come off the cell bodies, and also glial cells, but we're not really going to discuss the glial cells so much. Okay, so this back portion here is known as the dorsal gray horn, or you can call it the posterior gray horn. That's where that sensory input information enters into your central nervous system through the dorsal gray horn or posterior gray horn. Here you can see it on this model here. So only sensory neurons exist, in these structures here, which we'll talk about in a second. All right, off to the side here, we've got our lateral gray horn. Lateral gray horns, where we're going to find the cell bodies for our preganglionic neurons when we're dealing with the autonomic nervous system. Right, and so those neurons are going to control visceral effectors, which are going to be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. There's the lateral gray horn. Here's the lateral gray horn on this model. And then next is the ventral gray horn, also known as the anterior gray horn. The anterior gray horn is going to contain the cell bodies for our somatic motor neurons, right? The lower motor neurons that are going to innervate skeletal muscle. That's the anterior gray horn. Here is the ventral gray horn or anterior gray horn on this model here. Okay. So now we got one more, well, actually two more things that we're going to see in our gray matter. At the center is the central canal. That's this hole that runs down the center of our spinal cord. It contains cerebral spinal fluid. That central canal is lined with the ependymal cells, and they make cerebral spinal fluid. So here you can see the central gray horn on this model also. And then the last part of our gray matter is going to be this area here called the gray commissure. This is where we're going to see unmyelinated axons cross over from one side of the body to the other side of the body. We talked about that in chapter 14, when we were talking about some of our tracks there. So that's the gray commissure there. Here's the gray commissure over here. Okay. So you'll notice in the front there, right, we have kind of like an inward fold, and we refer to that as the anterior median fissure. Notice the spelling of the second word in the name, median. This is directly in the center of your body, so hence we give it the name median and not medial, right? Please don't write down the other one, right? Median, anterior median fissure, anterior median fissure. Make a note, highlight it, put an N there. Don't put any other letter. So in the back, we've got our posterior median sulcus. Also take note, the one in the back is a sulcus, the one in the front is a fissure. Sulcus is in the back, fissures in the front. There's the posterior median sulcus on this model here. You can see it again, the posterior median sulcus on our neck on this model here, okay? Okay. So now, as you remember, okay, we saw the swelling-like structure, right, in close proximity to our spinal nerve. And we know that the cell bodies for our primary neuron in our neuron chain, when we're talking about sensory input, right, the cell body for that primary neuron resides in this ganglion, We call it the posterior root ganglion, or you can also call it the dorsal root ganglion. That's what a ganglion is, folks, in the peripheral nervous system. It's a cluster of cell bodies. Now, like I said, most ganglions are going to have synapses. This one, you don't see those synapses because, all right, the cells are what we call pseudo-unipolar. So you have, it makes a T-like configuration. There's the cell body. Then you have one process that bifurcates. And in one direction goes an axon, and the other direction goes a single dendrite. Right, there's no synapsing that we see in the posterior root ganglion here because we're dealing with pseudo-unipolar neurons. All right, here you can see it a little bit better, the dorsal root ganglion or the posterior root ganglion with this model here. You can see that just kind of like that little swelling there just before we get to our spinal nerve over here. Speaking of the spinal nerve, there it is. The spinal nerve is going to be just distal to our posterior root ganglion. And so the spinal nerve exits from the actual spine, the vertebral column, through the intervertebral foramen, otherwise known, well, I'm not going to give you the short name for it, all right, the intervertebral foramen. All right, so you can see the spinal nerve here. You can see it better on this model here. Spinal nerve is a mixed nerve. Don't forget, has both sensory and motor neurons, but when it bifurcates, the sensory neurons go here towards the back, and then our motor neurons are coming from the front. Okay, keep that in mind. Spinal nerve, mixed nerve. So you'll notice, all right, when the spinal nerve does bifurcate and those sensory neurons head towards the back of the spine, we have what's called the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, also known as the posterior root of the spinal nerve. Those are going to be sensory neurons only. Here you can see it on the back. The dorsal root. It's pointing to one individual. If it was pointing to all of them, then we'd call them the dorsal rootlets or the posterior rootlets of the spinal nerve. All right, in the front, we have our ventral root of the spinal nerve, or the anterior root of the spinal nerve, and that's going to carry motor neurons. That will, by the way, include motor neurons, all right, for both the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. All right, our ventral root or anterior root of the spinal nerve. Then our spinal nerve, as it exits out of the vertebral column or spine, it gives a small branch off the back. And we refer to that as the dorsal or the posterior ramus. Dorsal ramus, posterior ramus. Remember, that's the little branch I showed you that would innervate the deep muscles of your back, and it'll also innervate the skin on your back. The sensory input will come from the skin on your back. That's the dorsal ramus. Then the spinal nerve continues on, and it's known as the ventral ramus or the anterior ramus. And we just got done talking earlier in lab class about all those anterior rami and what they do and what they give rise to. All right, so that's the ventral or anterior ramus. The spinal nerve also gives two branches that come off anteriorly. All right, remember the rami communicantes, or you can call them the ramus communicans. There's two of them, and they connect the sympathetic trunk to the spinal nerve. Obviously, if it's white, it's myelinated. Okay, so we call that the white rami communicantes. You won't be able to tell the difference on the test, which is which. And then, of course, those rami communicantes connect to our sympathetic chain or the sympathetic trunk. And so they allow us to connect our spinal nerve to the sympathetic trunk via the rami communicantes. And my friends, that is it for the spinal cord. Okay, one down